This is Tony from GreatIdeaz, and in this video we're going to look at how to add a custom REST API into a trellispark solution. We start by creating a new project, and we're going to search for REST API, and we're going to give the project a name. Now personally I prefer to use controllers rather than the new minimal API, so I'm going to leave this checkbox checked. Okay, so this is the project that we get by default, and we can remove some of the stuff we don't need. So I don't want to do weather forecasts, and I don't need a controller for weather forecasts. My app settings is fairly basic, and if I check out my program, I've got my initialization for Swagger, redirection authorization, map controllers, and so on. Now, one thing I do tend to enable is cores. So at this point I have a basic REST API with no controllers, and the initialization code and everything I need seems to be set up just fine. If I run it, it's going to find nothing to run. Okay, so if I run it, I just get this ZAPI, example API, no operations in the spec. So obviously there are no controllers created or mapped. So what I want to do now is add a few controllers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to here and I'm going to say add a new controller. And we'll start with an empty controller. We'll call our controller endpoint 1. Okay, so I now have an endpoint 1 controller. It's inheriting from controller base. I typically don't like the API. I just personally tend to go with controller, but it's a personal preference. So here I have an endpoint controller. So now what I want to do is add my first endpoint execute command. So I'm going to cut and paste some sample code. Okay, so here's my sample code for a REST API. This will be called endpoint 1, and its function will be execute command. Now you see we're passing in this GreatIdeaz type REST API command information. So to get hold of what this looks like, I'm going to need to add a reference to the GreatIdeaz shared types. So to do that, I'm just going to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. I'm going to browse GreatIdeaz trellispark and include pre-release builds and set my package source to all. So what I want is this one here, the shared types. Okay, so I'm looking for GreatIdeaz.trellispark shared. I'm going to add that to my project. And now I can add GreatIdeaz trellispark to my usings, and my command is good to go. So if I now save and compile this, I now have an endpoint that I've got an execute command on. Now this endpoint can be called from the trellispark user experience, and we'll show you in a minute how to configure that. But let's have a look at the internal structure now of execute command. So the question really is what does this REST API command information contain? So I'm going to be passing some command data into this endpoint. So what information should I be looking at, and how should I be consuming and using that information? Well, the first thing to look at is that we're being passed a couple of GUIDs. So we have all of these fields available to us in our command information. So we have a session GUID. So this is the session that the user is currently signed into. And we also have the user GUID of the user. So these two fields are basically giving us our security context. To make anything work in the database, we're going to need a valid combination of a session GUID and a user GUID. And these are two fields that are passed in using our command data from the user experience, and it comes in this REST API command information context. The other thing that we're going to get out of our command data is the instance GUID that we actually want to work with. And that is in the command data field current instance GUID. The current instance GUID specifies which instance record we're going to operate on, and the target instance GUID is indicating which data or which instance data we're going to use to operate against that current instance GUID. So think of the target instance GUID as the data we're going to modify. The target instance GUID information specifies data that we will use to modify the current instance GUID. Okay, another thing that's really interesting that we need to pull out of here is the actual command that we're going to attempt to execute. So there's another field in here called the command name field, and this is basically a text field that tells us how we're actually intending to process this particular command. So what is it that I'm going to do with my current instance GUID and my target instance GUID? How am I going to use that data to process the current instance GUID and return a result to the user? So typically our execute command functions are going to go into a nice big switch statement using the command name, and then we would have a whole bunch of case statements to determine what happens for each command. So I can have one endpoint and it might be servicing 3 separate commands. Now, if the command name isn't one of the named commands in the command branches, then when I want to return an error back to the user, then I can use the error message function of the command data. So here I'm going to say that command was not implemented, and I'm going to give it the command name. So I've got some context for my user. So by default, when I call this REST API, I'm expecting that if the command works, that when the command completes, I'm going to return an error message, which is either an empty string if everything worked perfectly well and was good, or a non-empty string, which would tell me what the failure was. So any command that returns a non-empty error message is basically saying, hey, I failed. So given that we're assuming that an error message of an empty string means everything worked okay, a good safety check is to set the command data.error message to an empty string on entry, so that we know we're going to return an empty string unless something goes wrong. So it's always a good idea, clear it out, just a basic defensive check. So we have added a user message field to our command data, and this field is not related to whether the command succeeded or failed. It's simply there to provide additional context or user information as a result of executing the command. So for example, we might want to know how many records were updated by this command. So this is the basic scaffolding of a custom REST API endpoint within the Telerik framework. What's going to happen is that you're going to execute a command inside the user experience. The user experience will go to the trellispark REST API and decide, hey, this is a command that needs to be executed by a custom API endpoint. It will then reformat that command information for executing a custom REST API. It will then invoke this custom REST API and then return the result into the trellispark REST API, which then forwards it back to the trellispark user experience and indicates whether or not the command was successful or it failed.
To learn more about GreatIdeaz products and solutions, visit GreatIdeaz.com. That's GreatIdeaz with a Z.com. Thanks.